Chapter 1. At the moment when Kastner was pushed into the guard room, a prisoner under cross-examination finished a sentence which was drowned in the shuffle of papers and police boots. Across the table from him sat the Hitler official. He was true to type, heavy jaws, square head, close-cropped blonde hair, almost shaved over the ears. Instructions of the party. Since when? 1924. What were your official functions in the underground Communist Party? I'm not familiar with the underground party. Until January 1933, my functions in the German party were of a purely technical nature. The communist shifted his position, almost turning his back to Kastner. The voices and the faces no longer matched. The prisoner's voice was rather low and impersonal, as though he meant to convey by its very tone that it was not he who was answering, but some irresponsible person under compulsion. The voice of the official was casual, even more youthful than his youthful profile. Kastner waited for this adolescent, upon whom his own case depended, to reveal himself by voice and words. The latter looked at the prisoner, who was merely staring into space. You have been to Russia? Yes, as a technician. I was attached to the Elektrozavod. We'll look into that. What was your function in the German Republic of the Volga? Never seen it, nor the Volga. What cell did you belong to in Berlin? EX1015. We'll look into that. Under whose direction? The communist's back was now completely turned, and Kastner listened for the answer. A man named Hans. I could have told you that myself. What I want to know is his last name. Don't try to make a fool of me, you son of a bitch. We only know our comrades by their first names. That's a strict rule. What about his address? I've never seen him outside the cell. All right, I'm going to put you in one of our cells. You'll be surprised how that will refresh your memory. How long were you in Moabit? 6 months. 180 days since your arrest? Kastner only now began to think of his own. The SA men had taken him in a bus for the first stage of the journey. With its Nazi passengers, it had been more oppressively close than a police truck. Among his several activities, he was in charge of a small factory manufacturing variable pitch propellers, and was entitled to the use of an airplane on occasion. There the plane was resting in its hangar, and during the whole journey Kastner had been able to think of nothing else. At a street corner they had passed some painters who sang while they repainted a chandler's shop front, as many colored as the Red Square. Until now, all that had seemed unreal to him, but more like a ritual than a dream. 180, resumed the official. Well, well. By the way, who's sleeping with your wife all this time? Did the prisoner, whom the official fixed with his gaze, acknowledge the hit? Kastner felt him intensely present, at once riveted to the spot with his whole helplessness, and absent with his whole strength. The official's tone was no longer aggressive. Who sleeps with your wife? He repeated. Kastner began to put himself in the communist's place. It was confusing to be both spectator and suffering actor. I am not married, answered the prisoner, whose profile again became visible. Another silence. That doesn't prevent you from having a woman, said the Nazi, at last with the same indifferent voice. The two men looked at each other now with a tired disgust. The official made a motion with his chin. 2 SA men led the prisoner away, then pushed Kastner towards the table. The Nazi looked at him, opened a record file, and took out a photograph. Like all those who sometimes have occasion to hide their identity, Kastner was thoroughly familiar with his own long, equine face, its firm set jaws. What picture was the Hitler official examining? Kastner saw it upside down. Not very dangerous. At that time, his head was shaved, and the expression in the narrow, bony face with its pointed ears was appreciably different from the one he revealed at present beneath his longish crop of chestnut hair, the look of a broken-down thoroughbred, vaguely romantic. In the photograph, his lips were tightly closed. He knew that when he smiled, his long teeth showed to the gums. Biting his lower lip likewise exposed his teeth. He did so just slightly, for he had an aching molar, and lowered his glance to the table. His large eyes had a way of looking slightly upward at an object, and by merely seeming to lower them, he could blot out the white slit between the iris and the lower lid. Without saying a word, the Nazi alternately scrutinized the picture and the face. Kastner knew that if he was recognized, he would be killed, with or without trial. "Kastner," said the Nazi. All the scribblers, or SA men, raised their heads, and for the first time Kastner saw his record written on hostile faces. "I am known in my legation. The most idiotic conspirator does not ask members of the police militia for a light and walk into a trap under their very eyes." The scene of his arrest came back to him in all its vividness. He was with several comrades in a little antique shop kept by one of them, half an hour before a dental appointment, when one of the members of the illegal organization had come in, hung his coat over a pile of dalmatics, icons, chasubles, and other orthodox ornaments, and said as he sat down, quote, "The police have set a trap at Wolf's. They're going to raid the place," end of quote. Wolf had got up. "I have a list of names in my watch case." They had instructions never to leave names on their premises. "You'll be arrested as you go in. Where's your watch?" "In the closet, in the pocket of the black vest. But it's..." "No nonsense, the list. Give me the keys." On arriving, Kastner had met two SA men in the hall. It was no longer even a trap. He stopped in front of them, tried to light the cigarette between his lips with an empty lighter, asked the SA men for a light, went upstairs. In ringing the bell, he leaned against the door to hide his hand as he inserted the key, entered, shut the door, opened the closet, took the watch, put the list in his mouth, replaced the watch, and reshut the closet door. No footsteps on the stairs. He would be arrested when he went down. Nowhere in this room to throw the door key, and to open the window would have been absurd. He slipped it into the pocket of one of the trousers hanging in the closet. Wolf might have several keys. He would wait 5 minutes as if he had come to pay Wolf a visit and had not found him in. The taste of the paper he was chewing with considerable pain. Was it neuralgia or his bad tooth? If only this had happened after the dentist. Reminded him of the pasteboard smell of carnival masks. At best, it would not be easy to get out of this. False identification papers cannot be counted on for much, and he did not look forward to the Nazi prisons with any optimism. Who knows the limits of his own endurance? How many times had he been told that prisoners on hard labor wear themselves out to obtain a little extra food, so that when they are released they are unfit for their illegal organization work? He threw away his cigarette, added to the taste of the chewed paper. That of tobacco was nauseating him. Then he had gone out and had been arrested on the landing. Quote, "At my factory you will find a correspondence of more than 15 letters between Mr. Wolf and ourselves. Don't you see?" End of quote, said Kastner. "All the goods have been delivered." The illegal organization had taken precautions. The Pilsen accent was not bad, but Kastner was really from Munich. He had formed the habit, when he was doing party work, of casually slipping the phrase "don't you see" into his speech. It revolted him to speak cordially to the Nazis. He watched himself to no avail and spoke slowly. Both men knew how difficult it is to prove the spuriousness of a minutely prepared false identity. The Nazi skimmed through the record, raised his eyes, again examined the record. A photograph, Kastner was thinking, and the description. What else? What about all those sheets? The essay had verified the fact that Kastner had asked him for a light, but how had he entered? The key had not been found on him, granted, and they had heard him ring, but would they believe that the door had been unlocked? How did his life look on those bits of paper? A miner's son, a scholarship student at the university, the organizer of one of the proletarian theaters, a prisoner in Russia who had gone over to the party and then to the Red Army, a delegate to China and Mongolia, a writer returned to Germany to prepare the Ruhr strikes against the Papen Decree, an organizer of the illegal intelligence service, a former vice president of the Red Aid. Enough evidence to have him shot, obviously, but quite compatible with a happy-go-lucky character. It's not any more difficult to go to the legation with false papers than into the street, said the Nazi. But Kastner felt him hesitate, and all those about him were hesitating. People instinctively feel that a romantic life should betray itself in a picturesque face. It seemed as though Kastner, the chronicler of the Siberian Civil War, whose accounts of his experiences were so intensely vivid and revealed such a robust gift for communicating powerful emotions, was expected to carry with him the dramas which he had lived and described, and his life became confused with the epic of rag-clad Siberia. Moreover, his presence in Germany since Hitler's triumph was known, and all the defeated treasured in him both the companion, his role was an important but not a crucial one, and the future chronicler of their oppression. Even for his enemies, his person was identified with what he had experienced, like a traveler with the country he has traveled through, like a bystander with the catastrophe he has narrowly escaped. All expected a face which bore traces of Siberia. No doubt they had found such traces in the photographs published in the newspapers not so long ago, where it was easy to supply them. A living face lent itself less easily to such modifications. Almost all those who hesitated were ready to ridicule the idea that this fellow might be Kastner. The official left the room, returned, closed his file, and made the same motion with his chin as at the end of the preceding examination. 2 SA men pushed Kastner towards the door. Then, with a series of blows and kicks, nothing, however, beyond the conventional military brutality, towards the prison. If they had decided to finish me right away, thought Kastner, they would have led me to the guardhouse. But no, corridors and more corridors. He was finally incarcerated in a rather large, dark hole. After some minutes, the darkness was gradually absorbed by the walls, whose gray paint began to appear. Kastner paced round the cell, idly active, thinking without being conscious of his thoughts. He became aware of this and stopped walking. It struck him that the wall was dirtiest by the door and close to the floor. Because of those who, like himself, had walked there, there was no dust. The cell had a German cleanliness, hygienic. Was it dampness? Already he perceived that his questions were mechanical, while his mind went round in a circle like his idiotic body. I must look more and more like a horse. His eyes had ceased roving. They had understood quicker than his brain. The wall at its base was covered with writing. In order to escape from the present, his thoughts grasped at everything that came within their reach. But what could he think about? If he was identified, it was merely a question of whether they would soon come to kill him, to torture him, or merely to beat him into unconsciousness. He might as well read the inscriptions on the walls. Many were partly rubbed out. Some were written in code. If I have to stay here, I'll try to decipher them. Others were quite clear. He resumed pacing round the cell very slowly, focused his eyes on the most legible ones, and read as he drew nearer. Quote, "I don't want," end of quote, the rest rubbed out. Another, quote, "Dying in the street would have been less rotten after all than to die here," end of quote. Several times since becoming a prisoner, Kastner had told himself that if they had used actual violence, they might have won over that majority of workers which they needed. But he was keenly aware of the romantic streak in his own makeup, and was on his guard against it. A phrase of Lenin's obsessed him, quote, "You cannot win with the vanguard alone," end of quote. Since his return to Germany, Kastner had felt that it was impossible to create unity among the workers without activity in the reformist and Catholic trade unions. that the work within the trade unions and the factories was insufficient to train them adequately for militant struggle. The revolutionary workers were the first to be laid off. They had been forced into the handicrafts, and barely 1/10 of the party was active in the great factories. The year before, there had been fewer strikes in Germany than in France, England, and the United States. Kastner had been active in organizing the Red trade unions. Their membership had grown to more than 300,000 by the end of the year. But this was still too little. Now, with Hitler in power, it was necessary to organize the union of all the revolutionary forces within the factories themselves and to unite these forces on issues raised by the day-to-day developments which must be transmitted as quickly as possible and effectively linked with the activities initiated by the base organizations. Kastner had accordingly been working since January in the intelligence service. It was one of the most dangerous and the most legible inscriptions, the most recent, had no doubt almost been written by men belonging to it. He drew close to another one, quote, "My hair is still black," end of quote, and as if the choice of this inscription had originated in some sharper, surer force within him than his sight, footsteps became audible. The sounds became jumbled. 3, 4 men, 5 at least, perhaps 6. 6 SA men could be coming here together at this hour only to use violence. The door of a distant cell opened and closed again on the clatter of boots, which suddenly sank into the wool of silence. The thing to be feared was not so much suffering or death, it was the sadistic ingenuity of those on whom the door had just closed. Throughout the world, it is always the most degraded who choose this calling. And the tormentor is always stronger than his victim in the last stages of humiliation or suffering. Quote, "If they were to torture me to make me give information which I didn't have, I could do nothing about it, so let's assume I don't know anything," end of quote. His courage at this moment was intent upon separating the man who in a few minutes would be in the power of that menacing shuffle of boots from the Kastner he would once more become. The power of the prison was such that even the guards spoke almost in a whisper. A scream suddenly filled his cell, drawn out to the limit of the breath, and finally smothered in a gasp. He must seek refuge in complete passivity and the irresponsibility of sleep and madness, and yet keep watch with a mind sufficiently lucid to be able to defend himself, not to let himself be destroyed here irremediably, tear himself asunder so as to yield only what was unessential. The cry rang out again, sharper this time. Kastner pressed his fingers into his ears, but it was useless. His mind had already seized the rhythm of the pain from which those shrieks were torn, and awaited the cry at the very moment it was repeated. He had been through the war, but he had never heard the screams of a tortured man within closed walls. The war-wounded moaned, and their cries had nothing in common with these, especially terrifying because of their mystery. In what way were they torturing this man who was yelling? How would he himself soon be tortured? Torture in the open air suddenly seemed a boon. The door closed and the steps came towards his cell. He realized that he was leaning against the wall of his cell as if his back were glued to it. With his shoulders hunched. He was firm, but his knees were not. He left the wall, exasperated by the limpness of his legs. A second door slammed shut on the footsteps, as if it had captured them in passing. Silence over a seething nest of tiny sounds. He turned again towards the door. Quote, "Stahl was killed the," end of quote. The sentence was unfinished this time, not obliterated. The wall exuded human destinies. He remembered a letter from a prisoner's wife, quote, "How they beat him. I couldn't recognize him. Therese, among the others," end of quote. How many of his comrades would come here after him? His pencil had not yet been taken from him. "We are with you," he wrote. On removing his hand, he read another inscription. "Before a month is up, I am going to kill Federwish." This was the man who had been but lately one of the camp wardens. Which one was dead, the threatener or the man who was threatened? Even as his roaming eyes seized the scrawled lines, his alert ears caught the sounds of the guard's footsteps, vague scratchings in the neighboring cells, and a sudden outburst of abuse in some outer court, at once choked by the corridors and clarified by distance. Still no cry. He was beginning to live entirely in a world of hostile sounds and noises, like a menaced blind man. He knew how difficult it is to submit to blows without retaliating, and he fully realized where his strength lay, the wholehearted self-surrender which often enabled him to penetrate to that benumbed region of a man's heart in which the memory of his dead is still vivid. But he was not eager to talk to the Nazis. Besides, it was not the disinterested followers of Hitler who had chosen to be prison guards. Kastner knew, moreover, that if every man is capable of killing in the heat of combat, it requires surrender to an abject loyalty to strike a prisoner. All he had to do was to say nothing. He did not have to answer blows by memorable words. He had to get away in order to resume his revolutionary work. And perhaps he would be beaten to death, but he remembered that at Hagen, in a factory of 750 workers, it had been impossible, in spite of the terror, to discover a single one of those who had distributed leaflets. You'll see how that will improve your memory. He remained standing in the middle of the cell, his elbows tightly pressing against his ribs, still waiting for another cry. Nothing. And yet, as the cell which the SA men had just entered was closer than the one before, he thought he heard deadened blows. Then, while he was still on the alert for a cry, there came a choked yelp, more distinct between the two metallic sounds of the opening and closing of a door. The steps again, very close this time. Kastner walked to the door of his cell, which opened the moment he reached it. 4 SA men entered, 2 remained in the corridor. Heads were lowered and arms menacingly advanced, lighted only by a storm lantern which one of them had put down on the floor. These were not the tragic figures he had imagined. In their postures, arms sticking out from the shoulders, crooked at the elbows like Hercules and the chimpanzees, they were caricatures of brutality. His terror vanished. It had been a primitive terror, a fear of suffering united with the unknown. And perhaps he had particularly expected the sadist, the drunkard, the madman, the inhuman. These men were not drunk. What about sadism? But now that they were present, exaltation and firmness had replaced terror. They were watching him, and no doubt they could see him no better than he saw them. Formless, with only the chin and cheeks lighted from below, and surmounted by their heavy shadows which sprang to the ceiling like enormous spiders. For the second time he felt himself squeezed into a cavity in the earth with all the rock of the prison piled around it. The light struck his own cheeks, too, from below, painfully. But no, it was his jaws, which he was clenching with all his might, that caused the pain. He noticed bitterly that he no longer suffered from his aching tooth. He resolved not to draw back a step. The blow of a fist in the stomach doubled him over as though he had suddenly caved in. And the moment his face dropped, another blow to the chin threw him violently backward. His ribs met simultaneously the hard resistance of the cement floor and the boots which began to kick at him. The mildness of the pain astonished him, though its violence was such that he was at the very edge of consciousness. With torture close at hand and all that he had imagined, there was something ridiculous about being beaten like this. As he had rolled over on his belly, the soft parts of his body were protected. Beneath the blows, his belly seemed the center of a protective cage of ribs and bones on which the boots were savagely hammering. A kick in the jaw. He felt himself spitting blood, and when he heard, "What, you're spitting your own flag?" a red blotch flashed and crackled before his eyes. It was from a kick in the nape of the neck. Then he fainted. He had a confused sense of being flung into another cell with a cry, "Auf Wiedersehen!" When the door of his cell again closed, his first sensation was one of comfort. This door, whose crushing weight hung over him, protected him from the abjectness and the absurdity outside. And at the same time, the solitude, the bareness, and the end of unconsciousness brought him back that dim sense of being enclosed which he had experienced in childhood, when he played Indian under the tables. He felt only relief. Would the night soon end? The guard opened a peephole in the door for an instant and then shut it. By the light from the corridor, Kastner saw in the back wall of his cell a grill which seemed to protect a ventilation hole, narrow and deep like a matriculation. As this hole had been walled in, it did not connect his cell with the outer world. It lived a self-sufficient and stifled life. It alone made sentient the crushing thickness of the stone. Kastner was in a vault, separated from the world as by sleep. By madness. But the whole gave the lifelike quality of a creature's shell to the thick, suffocating stone, which was riddled with cells where those prisoners who could still walk moved about like tireless centipedes. He sought the wall, struck it with his bent forefinger. Several knocks at long intervals. No answer. The exultation had vanished with the struggle. The sense of well-being which had benumbed Kastner when the door had shut was rotting into anguish. It was slipping away in shreds. From his sensitive skin, from his clothes which had become limp like night garments, with his suspenders and shoelaces torn away, the buttons cut off, he was not to commit suicide. The substance of the cloth seemed to have changed. What was it that was crushing him? The hole in the wall? Or was it the pain gradually piercing through his fever? Or the night? Convicts who are incarcerated in round cells, where there's nothing for the eye to fasten on, always go mad. He knocked again. The two threads of light at right angles which still outlined the door disappeared. His strength, grown parasitic, was gnawing him relentlessly. He was an animal of action, and the darkness was draining his willpower. He must wait, that was all. Hold out, live in a state of suspended animation, like the paralyzed, like the dying, with the same submerged tenacity, like a face in the very heart of darkness. Otherwise, madness.